Hello and welcome to the first Film Preservation and Restoration Summit. My name is Alicia Mayer and I'm joined by an esteemed panel of guests who are all experts in the field. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and they are joining us from Los Angeles to New York City and points in between. I'm going to ask each one of them to say a quick hello, and then they all have a presentation or a discussion to share with our audience. So I'll start that now by going to Theo Gluck from Walt Disney Company. Hello, Theo.
Hello, Alicia.
Wonderful to see you.
Nice to see all of you.
Thank you. And now to Ned Thanhouser. Ned, hello.
Hello, Alicia and everybody from Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Brilliant. And Elena Rossi-Snook.
Hello from New York.
Hello, Elena. And we have young Christopher Horak from UCLA. Hello, Chris.
Hi, how are you?
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. And I have Ron Hutchinson from the Vitaphone Project.
Hi, everybody from Cold, New Jersey.
Okay. And Dino Everett from the Hugh Hefner Archive, USC. Hello, Dino.
Hello, everybody.
Terrific. Well, that's a way to celebrate. So we're going to start with Theo Gluck, who has a fantastic presentation and some wonderful examples of restoration to share with us. Bear with me as I just make his frame larger and live. All right, Theo, off to you.
Thank you very much, and let's see if we can get this to work. So, one of the things we'll all be discussing today is the concept of preservation, restoration, and something that faces us at the studio a lot, of course, is reconstruction. Because some of these films had generational opportunities, especially the shorts, so after years of use, sometimes title cards get changed or swapped out. So one of the things we've been doing over the years is reconstructing these as originally released, so that's one thing I just wanted to make sure we all understood. One of the reasons the studios had a great success with the restoration work is, of course, we were an early adopter of Technicolor, which many people probably know in our audience was a really unwieldy process that used 3 pieces of black and white film in the camera to record the full color spectra. And it's an unwieldy process, and of course, 70, 80 years after the fact, you have 3 individual records of shrunken nitrate that now need to be realigned. And in fact, this is an example of what happens when you scan the Reluctant Dragon color sequences and just line them up without any kind of digital realignment. I sometimes like to say, this is not an anaglyph version of the film. This is truly what happens with YCM photography. So what the studio did was adopt what was called successive exposure, where you had one single strip of film, so therefore you had a far simpler optical path and a single focal plane. And rather than recording 3 individual strips of red, green, blue, you layered them next to each other in succession, red, green, and blue images. So, for example, Pinocchio might be 360,000 black and white frames to yield 120,000 color frames. This makes our alignment far easier, and the image energy and image integrity held in these original negatives is really the key behind the success of a lot of the Disney classic animation restoration. Also coupled with the fact that because of this type of photography, no one has ever been able to see what these films look like when taken off the original camera negative. So what Technicolor would have to do is make a series of elements from that and ultimately wind up with a strip dyed yellow, a strip dyed cyan, and a strip dyed magenta, all with their proper frames in order. And what that gave you, of course, was a print that effectively was a moving lithograph that you saw in a cinema. We now accomplish this digitally. One of the issues, of course, with nitrate film, nitrate separations as well as cell animation, is that we're working against 2 insidious problems. One is physical decay of the film itself over the decades, and the other is the kind of dirt and dust issues that might fall on the cells while animation was going on. And you constantly change the cells against a background, and lo and behold, you wind up with stop-motion animation of dirt and dust. So what you can see on this image is a frame from Bambi, And I like to think, I hope someone didn't sneeze on the negative, but what you see are red, green, and blue blotches, because that means that every frame of black and white negative that is composited to make this color image has damage on it. The good news is that given digital tools today and color correction, you can really get quite a stunning restoration out of it. And this was the first film that we did starting in 2004 with our big digital restoration work, determined that the films were pliable and viable, and that's why we scanned them at a 4K resolution. Other little things come up. This is actually a frame at the end of a reel of Bambi, and it actually has a changeover cue scribed into the original camera negative of Bambi. It's just practice of the time, and it's something that, of course, we're able to now remove digitally so it doesn't mar the image. The studio also was, as I like to say, we're really pioneering in a lot of technologies, whether it's sound with Steamboat Willie, color with Flowers and Trees, Fantasound for Fantasia, and of course we embrace widescreen technologies as well. Lady and the Tramp was our first CinemaScope animated feature, and Sleeping Beauty, as you can see demonstrated here, was photographed in the Technorama process, which meant you had successive exposure oversized frames equaling some 7.6 linear miles of negative that had to be scanned before you could even start the process. We're also not just about animation, we're of course live action, and the studio really began live action work in earnest in the early 1950s, and certainly no bigger film than 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was our first CinemaScope film, and used very early CinemaScope lenses, as you can see here, suffers terribly from anamorphic mumps, as people said, because of the distortion built into the squeeze coefficient of the original lenses. But we were able to digitally correct that image, and as you can see as it swipes up and down, James Mason has a far more human-looking head. But these are the sort of things that are constantly facing a library as diverse and as long a history as Disney. Pollyanna is another example of fading Eastman color negative. That is something that the entire film community has to contend with. On the left, you can see just how far the blue layer has faded out. But we are able to do this digitally. I think it's beyond photochemical redemption. But the digital tools today really allow us to maintain the artistic and physical integrity of the image. And so finally, just to show an example of what we're up against, this is a frame from the 2001 DVD of Snow White. And the problem is this was actually sourced all the way back to a 1993 early digital scanning technology, which scanned a 1987 photochemical duplicate color negative made from the safety masters. So that kind of image misalignment and fractured image actually has lived with the film for decades. But by scanning the original nitrate negatives, you have now control over the three original elements, and you get quite a stunning realignment and far better color, control of the color. Even though they're black and white images, you effectively now have component color images, not composite, to work with. So I think that in a nutshell sort of shows you what we're up against at Disney, and we're constantly looking at new technologies and new ways to bring this library and preserve it, restore it, and reconstruct it for generations to come. Thank you very much, and Alicia, back to you.
Thank you very much, Theo. I do have a couple of questions for you. So, for instance, we were just still looking at the frame then of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs of the Queen. Roughly how long, and this mightn't be a question you can answer, but how old do you think that print was before it begins that degrading process, so that we see what we saw then?
You know, it depends. I mean, the nitrate negatives have been very well cared for at the Library of Congress, so those are in very, very good shape. Mm-hmm. But you know, it's just you're hamstrung by the technologies of the time as to what you can do when knitting these back together.
Yes.
Because that's a photochemical process and mechanical process, you really can't actually see what you're doing the way you can digitally.
Yes.
Um, if that answers your question. So,
Yes, definitely.
um, you know, we're able to we tackle these once a new technology comes out. There was, and this is not in any way sort of besmirching the work that was done prior to it, because we're constantly pushing that envelope and always looking to find the best tools available. And
Yes.
this is where we are today. And no doubt there will be different scanning technologies and newer monitors on the horizon. And we'll all of us speaking today will have to address that level of resolution and color gamut moving forward.
In fact, just recently, the Association of Moving Image Archivists met in Savannah, Georgia. I think that was about 3 weeks ago. Was there anything that you saw there that related to animation and you think will have an immediate direct impact on preservation and restoration of animation?
I think the big thing facing everyone at this point will be the notion of high dynamic range, extended dynamic range. We started doing some tests, and they quite interesting results. So I think the nature of preserving and restoring animation, especially cell animation, the techniques are pretty much set. You know what you have to do in terms of dirt removal and color grading, but it's
Yes.
the level of resolution that you can ultimately get into that. But then, a debate for another time is there any value in a 6 or 8K scan of surviving elements on Steamboat Willie? What is the inherent image energy and integrity in the elements that survive?
So
Sometimes
for
it's a
the
discussion,
yes.
if you're talking about a 65 millimeter negative like Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes. So for the consumer, say for instance, such as myself, when my sons were young and my daughter was young, we might have looked forward to having the ability to buy a classic Disney title on DVD, and it seemed to not be out there, and we seem to be waiting and waiting. I guess you're the guy we're waiting on. Is that right?
Well, uh, there are a lot of people involved in this. I like to say that I may be speaking on behalf of the processes, but it is a huge team and of people who are very invested in preserving the library. So there are a lot of important decisions made in terms of how you present it, what technologies you do it with. Sleeping Beauty was our first animated classic on Blu-ray.
What was the
So
first one? Say that again.
Sleeping Beauty was the first one that
Sleeping
was
Beauty, right.
um,
Yes.
but the work was all done in a 2K and HD, so we could subsequently release them in HD. But that was the step we took until we were comfortable with how this would look in animation.
Yes, and so just give me an idea of the roles within the team so that we have a sense of who is doing what and maybe even in what sequence.
What normally will happen is we sometimes, if we can, will actually screen a print of the film, because that, of course, has had no cleanup done to it, so that'll give us a sense of what we're up against, because it really shows you the condition of the negative.
Yes.
But then it is a physical inspection of the negatives to determine what needs to be repaired. And then it's a rather laborious process at a high resolution to scan, again, triple the amount of frames you need to ultimately see a finished product. And then those have to be knitted together and aligned. And then comes the laborious process of, frankly, seat of pants to seat of chair, and actually getting the dirt cleaned up out of it. It's sort of a very intense picking up, dirt and dust. Again, because you have a constantly moving dirt and dust field every time a cell is moved.
All right.
And then there are decisions you have to make. See, when you're doing Peter Pan, you want to make sure it's dust and not pixie dust you're removing. There's also the notion, much like cleaning the Sistine Chapel, what is dirt, what is pigment?
Right.
So, which is why the restoration team that comes together when we're faced with a new classic feature or a particular short is we engage animators and scholars and people from the studio, feature animation, because I would certainly defer to them as to their thoughts as to, well, that may look odd, but it's actually the technique of the day, and you're altering the artistry or altering the artist's hand, rather than just blithely saying this doesn't look good.
Yes.
Certain technologies allow you to fix certain obvious paint flaws. We've had Mickey's ear pop off on one frame. Certainly our philosophy is if they could have fixed it, they assuredly would. And what
Yes.
scanned moments digitally would have been a huge project of repainting, inking, photographing, and coloring it back, getting it back to the lab.
So if essentially every element, every part of the process could be anything from a few months to potentially more than that. And so the restoration, where finally myself as a consumer, I get to actually buy the title, that may have been a very long project.
Um, it, it can be about a year once we
About a
start to
year.
deliver.
Sure.
It depends. Fantasia, it was a great deal of work, but that's also a long film of it's over 125 minutes.
Yes.
And again, reconstructing it back into its original as-released 1940 version, not the 1947 version, which is how the negative is now cut and conformed.
Right.
All of the eliminations were saved, and we scanned those and knitted it together. And I mean, just to give you an idea, that film also was photographed in both 3-strip Technicolor. The animation was successive exposure. So it's a tremendous amount of detail, and you have to really make sure you've got every last frame accounted for.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
But it's about 8 to 10 months to do a project fully, a full feature, and then I can't speak to. I mean, there is the manufacturing, the processing of actually getting the DVDs out. But from a restoration point of view, it could be about a year. Or the live-action film, something like Mary Poppins was close to that as well too. Again, a long film. It has its own issues with fading color negative and the animation sequence. And then don't forget also there's the whole sound components as well too.
Sure.
So, Mary Poppins and Sleeping Beauty were pulling original stereo 35mm Mag Masters. We found the original stereo music recordings that were done in Berlin for Sleeping Beauty. So all of this, comes into play to make sure that, you measure twice, cut once.
And how many people would you estimate might work, say, for instance, on Sleeping Beauty, how many people were involved in actually the restoration of that?
Well, there's certainly the immediate team of people at the studio, so you may have, 10 to a dozen people between, again, feature animation, marketing, the head of the music department for the studio, because music is such an important component in a lot of these Disney films, and we are doing some equalization and some mixing. We will always, bring them in for their aesthetic advice and feelings as well too. But then, there are our our partners and the vendors who we work with. We partner on this, and they may have dozens of artists working on the cleanup. So, in that regard, there are, dozens of people behind the scenes working on this, and it's a very strong collaborative process because you want to make sure you're making the right decision. It's one thing to invite a director in because you're making a new HD master on a film they created 10 years ago.
Yes.
But who speaks for the director on Bambi or Snow White?
Of course.
So
which actually leads to my question about whether or not there was any indication in those very early days at Walt Disney Company that things were going to degrade and break down. Was there any? Is there any idea that did they know that? Any notion of that?
I think Hollywood, and I'm sure my colleagues online will agree. I mean, everyone knew about the fragility and the perilous nature of nitrate film. So that in and of itself is something that, and the studios had a long history of very good preservation. But we also have access to, through some very generous individuals, dye transfer Technicolor prints, which are a great source of color reference for us. And of course, there's also the studio's animation research library that holds original painted cells. So we will scan those, look at those, because we have seen nothing there that leads us to believe that the color we've seen on the cells has degraded over time to skew what we feel would be the correct color palette to use on the film.
Right.
And also everything, you take everything into account, even the fact that there's a Technicolor print projected through carbon arc light and not xenon bulb. So all of this is, we make sure we hit every conceivable element that would have affected the look of the film to make sure that we get it right. Personal opinion foisted as fact accomplishes nothing.
It is a bamboozling process, but the results are so precious. Thank you very much for giving us a presentation on film preservation and restoration from Walt Disney & Co., or Walt Disney Co. Thank you very much.
And thank you for really hosting what I think is going to be one of many great opportunities for all of us to share this with everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Theo. Let's hope so. I'm going to introduce you now to Ned Thanhouser, whose family also has a very prolific history in filmmaking. Let's put it that way. Ned, I found you on Facebook, and I was amazed to see that the Thanhouser production company had made nearly 1,000 films. I wonder if you could take us through your presentation now about what you discovered as the grandson of the founder of an early motion picture company.
Sure, Alicia. Thanks a lot, and hello, everybody. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint presentation. Let's hope this works. And in here, I'm going to talk about, see if I can find it. Here we are. Can you see that?
We'll just let it spring to life, Ned. I'm not seeing anything at the moment.
All right.
Are you seeing a screen presentation?
Not yet. Hold on.
Okay. The wonders of modern technology.
Yeah, here we are.
We can meet from around the world, but if you want to put up a PowerPoint presentation, that's going to be another story entirely. So
I'll just walk through it.
Okay, go right ahead.
Yeah, my grandparents were in the theater in the 1800s, both Edwin and Gertrude Thanhouser, and they acted on the stage for over 10 years in New York and across the country. And then they saw their business model of live acting being under attack by this new phenomenon called movies, or the flickers. And so they took their skills at being able to craft a story and tell a play on film, and founded the Thanhouser studio that was established in New Rochelle, New York, which was just 45 minutes from Broadway, where all the talent was located on the East Coast, which is the birth of film and cinema in America, with Thomas Edison over in Orange, New Jersey. And so from 1910 through 1917, the Thanhouser Company, as Alicia mentioned, produced and released over 1,000 silent motion pictures. Half of them were dramas, about a third were comedies, and there were 10% of them that were classic films, like Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, or H. Rider Haggard's Mr. Meeson's Will. So they knew that bringing classic stories to the screen, of which they had already produced on the live stage, was a strong suit for them. And one of the things they were really noted for was being able to mount a production on the screen that had very high production values. And this is one of the things they were really well known for. Now, I grew up with the story from my father that all the Thanhouser films were destroyed. My grandfather, Edwin, didn't see in the future that they were worth saving. And so he destroyed all of the negatives. And we were told by my parents that all the Thanhouser films went up in smoke, that they were gone. Mm-hmm. Well, we believed that story until I was watching a special on public broadcasting in 1986, produced by UCLA, that had a Thanhouser film on it, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I realized from that for every negative that Edwin burned, there were 30 or 40 or 50 prints that went into distribution that went to the four corners of the globe, literally. That started me on a 25-year quest to go find surviving Thanhouser films. And to date, I found over 225 of these films.
Wow.
For example, here's a copy of Only in the Way, which is one of the Thanhouser films that was released. This is a safety print. You can see the 35mm format. But this is a one-reel film, 1,000 feet of film, and it would run about 12 to 14 minutes when projected. And so I started a quest to go find films, and as I said, I found over 225, and there's 57 films that are online on my website that you can watch today.
Wow.
Everything from the very, very first film that Thanhouser produced, titled The Actor's Children, released on May 15th, 1910, through one of their last releases in 1917. Also, King Lear, the Shakespearean play, was also done by them in 1916. So there's a number of films and lots of history and artifacts that we've found in the past 25 plus years. That's all led up to me putting together in the past couple of years a 50-minute documentary film that relates the whole story of the Thanhouser studio. And what I wanted to do, and I think we can do this, I'll play a minute-and-a-half teaser or trailer for the film that will kind of give you an idea of some of the footage and some of the joy of finding this film. So I'll try and share this one with you. Okay, so here we go.
The Thanhouser Film Studio in New Rochelle, New York, made over 1,000 films in under 8 years. They featured the period's most popular stars and used cutting-edge effects. At their peak, Thanhouser films accounted for roughly 1/4 of all the independent films made in the U.S. And then suddenly, the studio disappeared.
Growing up, my father told me that my grandfather was in the early motion picture industry, but he destroyed all of the negatives, and none of the films survived. I always wondered, what did they look like? What kind of films were they? Just imagine how surprised I was when I found some, and I saw how important and influential these films were in the early American cinema.
That's terrific, Ned.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if you have any questions, want to see more, you can go to thanhouser.org. And again, you can see 57 films online and learn how to see the documentary online.
So tell us, why after 1,000 films did your grandfather and grandmother actually stop making films? What happened then?
Well, in 1917, the industry was under recession, and the industry was moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was the big shift. The recession, also driven by the outbreak of World War I, kind of dwindled a lot of the revenues that they were able to get by distributing their films in Europe. That revenue source dried up, so there was some financial pressure. But Edwin Thanhouser had made his fortune, if you will, and felt like retiring. He was in his early 50s and sold all the assets, and the industry moved to California, and he decided to stay on the East Coast where he was known and established his lifestyle. So I think that was kind of the best idea that we have about why he decided not to stay in the motion picture industry and move to Hollywood.
That is a remarkable story. Ned, thank you very much for sharing that with us. And again, you can go to thanhouser.org and not only view the 50-minute documentary which you've spent time working on and was recently shown, I understand, at a silent film festival in Italy.
Yes.
And also those many other films, I think they're in volumes. And so how many did you say are there to be looked at?
There are 57 films that are online that you can watch, or you can order them on DVD. So either way.
Oh, that's terrific. Ned, thank you very much. And now we're going to have a quick chat with Elena, and I'm hoping that Elena is there. She's good, great. So you're going to be on audio in that case.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had
That's all right.
Tech failures, but that's okay, as long as you can hear me, and it makes me more comfortable that you can hear me and not see me, maybe. So I'm Elena Rossi-Snook. I'm the archivist at the New York Public Library Reserve Film and Video Collection. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, or maybe have forgotten what your relationship is with the film collection at a public library, we have 16mm films that are, we categorize them as educational, but not instructional. We're not the classroom film that you might have been familiar with growing up in high school. So the way we define educational is something that is going to inspire learning, that is going to inspire discussion. So this could actually include some feature films as well. So a little history, going back to, let's say we'll go back to World War II. That's really when things took off, when librarians were looking for a means of reaching the 50% of the public that were not coming to the library for books. They weren't interested, and so administrators and librarians were thinking, how can we reach this part of the public that we're clearly not reaching with our usual product? And that's when they were looking at the ability of film. And this is actually going back to the turn of the century. In the 1920s, there were studies done on the effectiveness of film in education. The problem, of course, for public libraries predating the 20s is that the film stock was nitrate. So presenting nitrate in a public library venue was really problematic because you needed like the fireproof booth. And there's also no distribution network. So there's no really great way of previewing films and then setting up a program. So World War II came about. By then you have safety film, 16mm. You have an entire population that is habituated to learning through 16mm, well, whether it's soldiers who are learning how to effectively and efficiently clean and maintain their weapons, to civilians who are learning about our efforts in the war. So when we come out of 1945, the American public is very much familiar with this format and what it is capable of doing. And that's when libraries really started acquiring and lending films. So the New York Public Library was a little bit late to the game. We began acquiring films in the 1950s, and that's the collection that I work with. We started our own film library, which was to acquire and lend films to the public for free in 1958. And our policies have changed very little since then. Our efforts are in preservation to not only preserve the physical object, which is the 16mm film print, but to preserve the heritage and the integrity of the library collection. So when you come to the New York Public Library, Performing Arts Library, you come with your library card and you leave with a film case. And that's something that we are not negligent, you know, it's not something like preservation through negligence where no one shut us down so we just keep doing it. No, like that's something we actively champion. It's like, come to the library and get films. And I mean, it's one of those things where just by virtue of surviving the 90s when collections were being deaccessioned, we've become like the big fish in the little pond, and the hipsters love us. Like there's no way of getting around it. Like people in Brooklyn, when they hear that they can get films and that we welcome programming in public gardens and on rooftop cinemas, I don't know, it's fun. It's fun that we can maintain and preserve that relationship as well.
That's fantastic. So if I wanted to do that, I guess what I would see is I would have my card, I would go in, I would perhaps look at a catalog, a collection catalog, and then I would ask my friendly librarian to have access to X title, etc. Is that how that would work?
Yeah, we've had to do some shifting about. We work now with a staff of about 3.5 people, and we've had to use our own skills and technology to kind of make up for the fact that we're no longer like a 33-person department. But that hasn't impacted our service. So yes, you come in, and we have reference librarians. We also have forms that you can fill out with your request. I'm available through email and chatting. We have a dedicated hotline. So once you figure out what you want to watch, we make sure that you get it within a week. And we also have a private screening room too. Not everybody feels comfortable projecting film prints. And there is this great respect when people handle or use our material. There's a lot of anxiety because there's a trust right there. There's this trust that you're going to treat these unique prints well, and that you're going to return them. So people who do check the films out are very aware of that. Some people don't want the pressure, so they come in, and we welcome them to come in and set up an appointment in our screening room, and then we'll do all the dirty work with the projector.
And so to give me an idea of the title range, you mentioned how to clean your gun if you were a soldier, and that would have been one of the earlier prints. But what would be an example of something that I might share, say with children as an example?
Yeah, that's a great example, because that's the bread and butter of any public library film collection. We still send prints out to the branches of the classic children's films. If you were in a classroom or in a church or in a public library as a child, you probably saw something from the Weston Woods library. We have a very good, strong relationship with Weston Woods out of Connecticut, which does the classic children's books. So lots of that. We also have films made by children. I just did a presentation last night at the Orphan Film Symposium on the films in our collection that were made by kids in New York City in workshops. So there's that kind of relationship where it's like, why would we collect that? Well, because the idea is that this is a very much a curated collection. We don't take anything on deposit. So if you're a filmmaker and you've made something, you would approach the New York Public Library, and a panel of librarians would look at it, and if it was approved for acquisition, we'd pay you, and pay you fairly. A lot of independent filmmakers who have subsequently done very well for themselves came to the collection first because maybe they were able to afford to get one print, and we would pay them something really fair. We would give them $500 for film, which in the 70s, was really nice. And they would be able to use that money to make a distribution internegative and then put their film into distribution. Lots of times I go into a phone call with a filmmaker, whether it's Susan Seidelman or Ira Wall, and I'll say like, hi, I'm calling from the New York Public Library and we'd like to preserve your film. And invariably the response from them is, oh man, New York Public Library, Bill Sloan, who was our film librarian for like a million years, like he gave me my break. Like you guys were the one. It's like yes, oh, thank you, that's great. So we have a lot of those works that were, gosh, we've got Susan Seidelman's graduate project. We've got early stuff by Spike Lee. We have the children's films. We've got the stuff made by kids, because these were made by kids, and they're quality works. They're really good, but they're also things that people would want to see. So it's not a matter of looking at a film and saying like, oh, is this like the best film ever made? No, it's saying, is this the best film for our community? So some of the kids' works, like I'm looking at the Young Filmmakers collection, and there are days where I'm just like, I really need to be sure that this person never went on to make another film because they are the world's worst filmmaker. But there's something really energizing about knowing that if you give a kid a movie camera, they're always going to turn to the subjects of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that does speak to our community, and that's the principle upon which we acquired and preserved the film, is that it speaks to our community. So we've got a lot of avant-garde works. We've got one of the largest, if not the largest, public access collection of American avant-garde. We've had scholars come from all over the world to take a look at that. We've got features, and my favorite are the independent documentaries, especially the political documentaries. So one of the outstanding works of the early 70s was Cinda Firestone's Attica. If you want to know about the politics surrounding the Attica uprising, you have to see this film, and you really, to understand the context in which it was made, which is 16 millimeter. I mean, that was the format of choice for filmmakers who didn't need or want mediation. They didn't want financial obligation. So these are folks who would grab their camera, grab their audio recording equipment, and just run into the scene. Cinda Firestone from the Firestone family was a novice filmmaker. She didn't even know that she needed to communicate to her lab to make sure that all of the negative material that she sent them had to come back in a certain wind to match. So when we were preserving it, we were looking at all these different winds, and the lab is like, oh, do you want us to fix this? We can flip it. I was like, no, we have to leave it as is. Like, the fact that it was more important for her to get this message out about what was happening in Attica, like, that was more important for her than learning how to be a better filmmaker. So that aspect, we went into our preservation, just maintaining that history. So yeah, lots of stuff like that. You know, things about like New York in the 70s, Vietnam War. God, it's a rich collection. I'm in love with it.
That's wonderful, Elena. Thank you so much. I can hear in your voice that you're in love with it, and I wish that I was in New York City with a card in my hand right this moment. Thank you so much for making that presentation, and I hope that you can continue to listen in. I'm going to move now to Chris Horak from UCLA. He's the director of the UCLA Film and Television Archive, and the author of numerous books, and including a book that he's just recently launched, and it was published just about a week or so ago, Saul Bass, Anatomy of Film Design. There it is, and it has got the most sensational retro cover. I just adore it. Those colors are amazing. So, Chris, tell us what's up at UCLA.
UCLA Television Archive in 2015 will be celebrating its 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1965. We started off as a television collection. The first collection that came in was from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and from there, then, the second large collection that came in was the nitrate collection from Paramount. And so from that came in the late 60s. And from that point on, UCLA Film and Television Archive really grew in leaps and bounds to become what it is now, the second largest moving image archive in the United States and one of the 10 largest in the world. We have major film collections from, as I said, Paramount. 3 years ago, Universal deposited all of its nitrate, which they moved from the East Coast to Los Angeles. There was 23,000 reels of film that got moved into our nitrate vaults. We also have collections from Fox, Sony, and Warner Brothers. So those are our studio collections, and our preservation efforts began really with those collections. Bob Gitt, who had been working at the AFI in the 1970s, joined our staff in 1977, and from then on there was a heavy concentration on preserving that type of material. However, by the 1990s, we really began to expand into other areas. That started in 1982 when we received, as a donation from the Hearst Corporation, the Hearst Metrotone News Film Collection. And the Hearst Metrotone News was the official newsreel of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. It actually had started in 1916, but was bought by Lowe's Incorporated and became the official MGM newsreel in 1924.
Terrific.
We have not only all of the completed newsreels, and the newsreels ran until 1972, every week a new newsreel, but we also have all of the original camera negatives shot by those newsreel cameramen. And in many ways, the raw footage shot by the cameramen is much more interesting than the completed newsreels, because, as you know, newsreels were supposed to be newsy, but they didn't really deal with hard news. For one, they came out once a week. Secondly, the motion picture companies wanted to stay away from any kind of political content, so there was mostly soft news. But the cameramen, in contradistinction to that, actually shot a lot of interesting stuff. And so now we get heavy use of the newsreel collection by documentary filmmakers, television producers, etc., looking for historical footage. Just recently, some of you may have seen the series on the Roosevelts done by Ken Burns. That included an awful lot of footage from the Hearst collection. Another example, one of our restoration projects was to do the concert on Easter Sunday in 1939 that Marian Anderson had done. She was a black opera singer, and she was supposed to sing in Constitution Hall, and at the last minute, it was because the Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. She was told that as an African American woman, she would have to go in through the back, the servants' entrance, and of course she was not willing to do that, understandably. So the concert was held at the invitation of Eleanor Roosevelt on the Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And the newsreel included maybe 25 seconds of that concert and 50 seconds of Harold Ickes, the Secretary of State of the Roosevelt administration, introducing her. So it was much more footage of the white guy introducing her than her. But all of the footage was shot, and the three radio networks recorded and broadcast that concert. So we've been able to actually reconstitute the concert with the audio and with the newsreel footage we've had. So that's been a real interesting project.
Wonderful.
Our big project right now, we have two big projects. One is we're moving into a brand new state-of-the-art facility in Santa Clarita, which will be the most modern analog and digital preservation center in the world, and we will be moving in there shortly. And then as part of our 50th anniversary, we will again do our Festival of Preservation, which we do every 2 years and then send out on tour. And during this festival, we show all of our new preservation work. And that includes a lot of different material. It includes not only, as I said, a newsreel program and classic Hollywood features, but we are now, as of about 10 years ago, we have been had a partnership with Sundance, so all Sundance winners, we get at least one copy for the archive, and even longer than that, for about 13 or 14 years, we have had a cooperation with Outfest, and started with them the Outfest Legacy Collection, which is to date now, with about 30,000 titles in it, the largest LBGT collection in the world. And so our focus has really moved not away from Hollywood features, because we still do a lot of preservation, especially of independent and low-budget material. So, for example, in our next Festival of Preservation, some of the things we'll be showing are Victor Halperin's White Zombie from 1932, an even stranger horror film that takes place in Haiti called Owanga from 1936 by George Terwilliger. We're also showing a bunch of film noirs, Too Late for Tears, made in 1949 by Byron Haskin, The Guilty from 1947 by John Reinhardt, and we're showing independent work. So we most of our work is still analog, but we are starting to do digital preservation. So, for example, we just preserved Sam Fuller's one of his last feature films called Dead Pigeon on Beethoven Street, which he was shot in Germany, in German and English from 1973, and that is an all digital preservation. We also are continuing work on a group of films called the LA Rebellion. Those were African American students who went to UCLA, and in 2011 we did a massive LA Rebellion program that went on tour. But we're still doing other work because more and more comes in. With funding from the National Film Preservation Board, we were able to preserve, or better said, improve Illusions, Julie Dash's first film, which is an amazing short film from 1982. She's, of course, best known for Daughters of the Dust from 1990. But this film, Illusions, always had bad sound, and so in going through digital workflow, we were able to significantly improve the sound and the image on that film. Another independent film that we've been working on is Brandy in the Wilderness, which was one of a number of independent films made in the late 1960s, early 1970s, like David Holtzman's Diary. Brandy in the Wilderness was shot by Stanton Kaye, who only made 2 or 3 films and then left the field to become a computer guru. But the most interesting thing about that film is that it actually has 2 narrators. It's a story about a relationship between a young man and a young woman. And so first you see the film narrated through the young man's point of view, and then halfway it switches to the woman's point of view, and you get the same film, but obviously from her point of view. So it's actually quite different. And I know of no other film from that period that uses that kind of nouveau literature technique in terms of narration. So we're very excited that we're going to be premiering that too. I could go on, of course, and talk about a lot of other things, but that's kind of in a nutshell what we're doing.
That's wonderful, Chris. I actually do have some questions for you, but
Sure.
with the restart, I'm not quite sure how much time we have left. So if you'll just forgive me, I'm going to move on to Dino, and then hopefully we do have time, because I have a number of questions for you with regards to the new facilities and some interesting statistics about what we have lost in terms of films so far. So thank you, Chris. I'm going to move on to Dino now. And Dino Everett from the USC School of Cinematic Arts, particularly the Hugh Hefner Moving Image Archive. Hello, Dino. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for having me. Yes, I am the archivist here at the USC Hugh M. Hefner Moving Image Archive. And to clarify for some of those who don't know, this is not an archive of Hugh Hefner material. This just bears his name. This is the archive for the cinema school, which is one of the, if not the oldest active cinema school in the country. It began in 1929.
Yes.
So we have all of the student projects that they've made over the years. That's the bulk of our collection. And then we have a number of other sort of very eclectic collections here. I mean, we have Kim Novak's film collection. We have Vincent Price's home movies, a lot of Slavko Vorkapich's material, including his home movies. And then we also have a very large technology collection, which spans the history of motion pictures. The gentleman who set up the archive was a guy named Herb Farmer, who came to the school in 1938 as a student, stayed for 71 years. And
wow.
He was very interested in the technology and the business, as well as the creative side of motion pictures, and he kind of believed those three things you could never separate, like the technology from the motion picture creativity or the business from the creativity and things like that. And so I try to look at preservation in those regards. So if I'm working on a student project that was made on 16 millimeter, it's very important for me to preserve it on 16 millimeter. I believe in digitizing things for access, but I also believe that, you know, if I'm going to do a restoration on something, I want it to be the way it was originally intended to be seen. Right now, as far as student works, I've compiled a project that I'm calling Shock Value, which is based on a book by New York Times writer Jason Zinnemann about sort of the early 70s, 80s horror movement, and he mentions in the book about a number of them coming from USC in the 60s. So one of the we have like films of John Carpenter, Dan O'Bannon, a gentleman named Charles Adair who didn't really go on to a big theatrical career, and a couple other USC filmmakers, Terrence Winkless and Alec Lorimore. But I'm going to show a little clip here from a film called Captain Voyeur, which was one of John Carpenter's first films here at USC, and this was preserved in 2012 with a grant from the National Film Preservation Foundation. So let me call up that one, and it's about a 1-minute clip, so let me do that one right now. Okay. So that was a student film from John Carpenter from 1969, and that's one of the shorts that we have in this Shock Value program that has screened a couple of times in LA and is going out to play other theaters around the world. And we're hoping that the screenings will also in turn generate some funds that can go back into photochemically preserving some of the other shorts that I didn't get grants for. Some of the other projects we're working on, I have, like I said, we get in all kinds of random reels, and I tend to always be on the lookout for things that I think might need preservation, especially on eBay, which seems to be not just me doing that. I think a lot of archives now tend to look on eBay for things. And recently I bought a couple of lots of films because I recognized that they were early diacetate tinted prints, and in it was the final reel of Universal's first musical entitled Melody Lane from 1929. So the first thing I did was I sort of reached out to the enthusiast collector community and just said, hey, does anybody know if this title has been restored? What's the status? And people sort of mentioned, no, it hasn't been restored. So then I reached out to Ron at the Vitaphone Project to find out what sort of discs survived, and luckily I found reel 8 film and reel 8, the disc survives. So in a nice collaborative effort, the film material went to Mike Feinberg at Universal and is currently with Kim Young over at Photochem, and I got the sound from Ron, and the sound is going over to Photochem as well, but I quickly pieced together a little clip that we could look at here just to show this this otherwise lost Vitaphone feature, at least a little tidbit of it here today. So let me open that one up real quick.
And for some reason, we're not hearing the sound. Dino, and that might be your microphone and your headphones. Mm-hmm.
So the sound didn't come through?
No, it didn't, unfortunately, and it might possibly be because of the earphones plugged in right now. So that's a shame.
But did the sound come through on the other clip?
No, we didn't have sound on the other clip either.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. That's disappointing.
Well, I'm wondering whether or not it might be your earphones plugged into that mic right now.
Okay.
And so, do you want to just quickly try that again? I'm not sure how much more time we have, but let's just see if we can hear even a snippet of that, because it's terrific. No, I can't hear Dino now. Okay. No, can't hear you right now. I think you need to unplug your microphone from the laptop in order for us to hear that sound. Your earphones. Can't hear you. No. There we go. Can hear you again. That's great.
You can hear me now. Okay.
Yeah, that's.
All right. Let me.
So why don't we just give that one more try, and then,
Okay.
and if that's not successful, we'll move on to Ron, who's been patiently waiting.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ron.
All right. Let me.
All right. Let's see what happens.
All right. Let's try sharing this here.
Well, as it goes in showbiz, worked perfectly in the rehearsal, but sadly no sound now, which is a bit of a shame. Yes. Okay.
Disappointing.
Yeah, no sound, unfortunately. Well, let's hope that we give another chance to do that, because I really did enjoy hearing that in the rehearsals. And of course, the whole point of showing that was that you were able to marry the sound and the visual.
Right.
And the sound came from Ron. And Ron is our next guest, so I'm going to move on to Ron Hutchinson from the Vitaphone Project. Thank you so much, Dino, and we will try that again separately in a separate Hangout. Hello, Ron. Thank you so much for waiting patiently. I'm going to enable you to present to everyone. And Ron, you have come from the Vitaphone Project, which is a project that you founded and has now been in operation for a couple of decades at least. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. We had the idea about 24 years ago of trying to track down initially, before the internet, what might be in collectors' hands as far as the lost soundtracks of the sound on disc Vitaphone system. In other words, when talkies finally started to succeed after decades of failures of synchronization and filling a theater with the sound and so on, in the early 1920s, Warner Brothers partnered with Bell Laboratories with a new process, and I'll show a couple of shots of what the projector and the discs look like shortly. But bottom line was the picture and the sound were two separate elements. And over the years, needless to say, the discs were broken, they were lost, they were separated from the film. So in 1991, we formed the Vitaphone Project with the idea of reaching out first to collectors and seeing what they might have in their personal collections that nobody knew about. Here's a typical 16-inch shellac, 33 1/3 Vitaphone soundtrack disc, and it holds one reel of sound matching one reel of picture. And right. We first thought that, we might hear about a few hundred of these, but what we found over the years is, believe it or not, over 4,000 discs in private hands, and then working with UCLA, the Library of Congress, Warner Brothers, and the other studios and private collectors, we were able to work to get a lot of these short films primarily, but some features matched up again with their soundtracks, synchronized on a modern sound on film print that could be enjoyed again. We've really formed a partnership with all of these various organizations. I think a very unique partnership in getting these films restored. In a lot of cases, they were vaudeville acts like Burns and Allen, Jack Benny, many other performers who would go into the Vitaphone studios, film their act intact, and they would be shown. They called it vaudeville in a can. They would ship them throughout the country, so a theater in the Midwest could have Al Jolson on their screen and pay $10 for rental, whereas he probably would get $10,000 for that same appearance.
Wow.
So it's just been a fascinating project. I've been able to meet a lot of the performers or families of the performers. The first Vitaphone short that we restored were involved with restoring with UCLA and at the time Bob Gitt was Baby Rosemary, the Child Wonder. And if anybody remembers the Dick Van Dyke Show, Rosemary was Sally, one of the comedy writers on that show. But she was a child singer, and at 7 she made a 1929 Vitaphone short. And we were really lucky enough, that being the first restoration we were involved in, I was lucky enough to sit next to her at the UCLA theater when it was screened, and everybody was looking at this little girl belting out a song like an adult, and then looking over at this, at the time, I guess, 75-year-old woman, and kind of looking back and forth. So it was a really, really neat experience. Let me just switch over to just a couple of visuals, if I could, and kind of show you what we're talking about on Vitaphone. This is a shot of what a Vitaphone projector looked like, and you'll see a turntable in the lower left portion that had one of the discs like I just showed you, and that turned at 33 1/3, which started a precise starting spot with a steel needle, and a precise starting spot for the film would be put in the gate, and they'd throw the switch, and one motor drove both the turntable and the film, and as long as the film didn't break or the needle didn't skip, it actually stayed in synchronization. And of course, we've all seen Singing in the Rain, and we know what happens if it didn't stay in synchronization. So that by early 1930 or so, this system rapidly waned in favor of the sound on film process, which is a lot less bulky, a lot more reliable. So let's see if we can get the... Here's a shot of a Vitaphone disc that I showed you. It started on the inside and played outward, and what you would have is the requirement that because the sound would deteriorate the more you played it with these heavy steel needles, they were supposed to mark off in the projection booth how many times they played it with a maximum of 20. So you can see this is from a Vitaphone short, and they played it 2 times so far, or supposedly anyway. So as I said, this is a very unique partnership with the studios, primarily for Vitaphone, Warner Brothers, but we certainly have been involved with other studios, early talkie films. The Library of Congress very often has the film or picture element. UCLA Film and Television Archive has worked on over 100 of these shorts over the years. Private collectors who either loan the use of their discs or donate them, or provide funding to pay for making prints or some of the other costs involved. And then, of course, our project, which kind of works to try to pull everybody together, identify opportunities for future restorations. So as I said, so far we've had about 120 or so shorts, mainly from the mid-20s to early 30s, while the disc process was kind of reigning supreme at Warner Brothers, and also some features where the disc is the only or best sound element, things like All Quiet on the Western Front, Emperor Jones, and so on are two examples. And over 4,000 discs. Imagine those big discs in private hands worldwide. Of course, now the internet has enabled us to hear from people all over the world who say, email me and say, I have a box of these discs, or I have 3 of these, and then we'll check to see if they match any film that is still lacking sound, and so on. And then also just outright donations of people who love this stuff. Hugh Hefner, big surprise, funded the first all-girl band shorts from the 1920s. But we have many people who love vaudeville or opera or whatever, and have been very generous in that regard. A big find, Alicia, you certainly know, in Australia, which I think is the hotbed and frontier for future discoveries, because films would go from Hollywood and it was too expensive to ship them back, so they tended to stay there. So many American films that are thought lost were found in Australia, this being one of them. Long lost Technicolor 1933 short with the Three Stooges called Hello Pop, which in an ironic twist on this presentation here, was directed by Jack Cummings, Alicia's uncle. And
yes.
He was later a big producer at MGM, of course, but he directed shorts at the beginning. And this film was burned up. The only other known print was burned up in the same big vault fire in the 60s that London After Midnight and The Rogue Song and many other films were lost in. So this was found, repatriated, restored, and it was out on DVD about 6 weeks ago from Warner Archive. And 2 other big finds or rediscoveries, I should say, are Colleen Moore, one of the biggest stars of the 20s, final 2 silent films, one called Synthetic Sin, and this one called Why Be Good, which actually we're going to be screening at Film Forum. I'll be hosting it next Sunday. Real flaming youth, wild flapper, Art Deco heaven type of presentation and film, with a really rousing, jazzy Vitaphone score. Actually, they used the discs that I had in my own collection. So these things just keep turning up, I think, more than ever. Big cache of fragments of Technicolor films found in England earlier this year. These are spools that run 45 seconds to about 1.5 minutes that were found, and they're all scenes from musical Warner Brothers features that previously were not known, things like Shows, On With the Show, Gold Diggers of Broadway, and so on. So the discoveries just keep on coming. I think the internet has really facilitated a lot of that. And any folks who find one of those big discs and want to let me know about it, they can certainly contact me either at my email here, ron@vitaphoneproject.com, or check out our 20-plus years of newsletters about discoveries and restorations and partnerships and so on at our website, vitaphoneproject.com. So
that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. And I know that you have a very active Facebook group, which is where I probably found you.
Yes.
And yes, and so people can join you on Facebook. There's a very strong community, a very wonderful sharing community of everything to do with film preservation and restoration.
Yep. Thank you.
Absolutely. Wonderful. I'm going to cut. We're still live, which is a fantastic miracle. So I'm going to just go back to Chris, who I did have some questions of. Chris, if you want to unmute your microphone, that's great. And hopefully we can hear you. Chris, Chris, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes, yes.
That's terrific. So, what I was reading in my research about UCLA is that 50% of all films made before 1950 have actually disappeared. 90% of classic film prints in the US are in poor condition. And historic TV is pretty much saved on obsolete and deteriorating formats and so forth. So I think the four-letter word in your life is cash. Is that right? And what do you spend your time on? And is it chasing money quite a lot of the time?
Well, as director of the archive, yes, it is looking for funding. Most archives, public archives, of course, are nonprofits, or we're part of the state of California, but like the rest of the university, only 15% of my funding actually comes from the state. So 85% I have to raise myself. And
Wow.
certainly all the money we need to do specific preservation projects and restoration projects comes from third-party sources. So that is indeed a major part of my job, is to find funding. There are a number of sources that, frankly, many of us go to for funding, whether it is the Film Foundation or the National Film Preservation Foundation, but then also organizations like the Warhol Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and then, of course, many private individuals. Ron just talked about the Vitaphone Project, and we have been extremely happy in our cooperation with Ron and the Vitaphone Project, because he has marshaled many enthusiastic collectors who have actually put their money where their mouth is and helped us
Wow.
preserve a lot of these shorts. And this wouldn't have come about without this kind of real cooperative effort that is also bi-coastal, you know, because and a lot of people are on the East Coast and we're on the West Coast, but it's that community has really helped, and it's very important to all of us.
And the new facility is just simply ginormous.
Yes, it is. It is ginormous. It is a $200 million facility, which will. In 2008, we opened up our nitrate vaults already, which are the most modern nitrate vaults on the planet, because who in 2008 was still building nitrate vaults for film material that's, you know, at that point 68 years old? And but it's important for people to understand that yes, nitrate film is highly flammable, but if you store it properly, it'll last a long time. We know that our nitrate stored cold and dry is probably going to last for 300-400 more years. Certainly a lot longer than any digital information that we may produce from it. Yes. So that's very important to know, because it also gives us a much bigger window in which we have to preserve the material that has survived.
I ran into a link, I ran into a URL that had hundreds and hundreds of titles that had been preserved so far, and I will share that URL with everyone after this program. But I was stunned to see, you know, it just went on and on and on. Films with wonderful directors, some very well known, some not so well known, and this list is just incredible.
Well, we've been at it again for now since the mid-1970s, doing active preservation, and so yeah, after a while, more and more gets done. But there's of course always more to do. Like one of our new big projects that we started about 2 or 3 years ago was to preserve the work of Laurel and Hardy. We received all the surviving negatives from the Hal Roach collection of Laurel and Hardy's films, and they were frankly in god-awful condition, because films that are popular get used much more than films that aren't, and therefore the negatives were worn out, and a series of distributors who had bought the rights would change things, and so a lot of work needed to be done. But we actually started an internet crowdsourcing campaign to fund that, and on our website, which is cinema.ucla.edu. And
Yes.
we have managed through that source to actually bring in enough money, and we've now restored about 6 or 7 shorts and 1 feature, and we will continue with that project until, again, the majority of the work we still have does get preserved.
That's really wonderful, and to think that the public care enough to really pony up some money is exactly what I'm hoping will come from this. So thank you very much, Chris.
You're welcome.
Just going to see whether or not Dino can possibly show that clip with sound now, because it was so wonderful to hear in our rehearsal. So Dino, just unmute your microphone and let's try that again. Thank you so much. Okay, Dino, up to you. And I can't hear Dino. No. Unfortunately, cannot hear Dino.
Can you hear me yet?
Yes, can hear you now. Yes, wonderful.
Okay,
Yep,
so that's one step closer. Let's see if we can do this. And tell me right away if it doesn't work, and I'll stop.
Sure. Sure, that's fine. Thank you very much. There we go. Yay. Look what happens.
And I got 30 weeks of booking with risking the hatches.
All day when Connie was out of her head, she kept repeating the story 3 a day.
I'm rolling in the moonlight now, and the daytime rolling in the sunshine. Oh, everything is beautiful now, and they are gonna be mine. Oh, them rolling, rolling, mine. Oh, them honey to the sky, I could fly. The fragrance from your beautiful, you're always beautiful.
Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dino. That worked.
Yeah.
And so if I understand correctly, that is Universal's first musical.
Yes.
And this film was in the lot that you bought from eBay, and then through collaboration with Ron, you were able to do that quick snippet, which I know you're doing the larger restoration, the larger project, but you were able to marry up the sound and the film for the first time in many decades. Yes.
Yeah. And I thought it showed it showed sort of like that project. I think shows the good and the bad that's out there, where the bad part was the seller on eBay was selling 3 lots of film.
Mm-hmm.
All of the lots just said random reels, and I tried to buy all 3 of them to hopefully keep everything complete. But the third lot said something about Oliver Hardy, and so I lost that lot to somebody else. But who knows? There might have been other reels of Melody Lane in there. I contacted the seller and asked them if they would please put me in touch with whoever purchased that lot. And I contacted them many times, and they would never respond. So what happens
just
sometimes
terrible
is collections, like somebody collected a bunch of material and then it gets passed on to the next family member, or gets sold off at an estate sale, and then it can go out into a million different directions. So there may have been a complete Melody Lane reels 1 through 8, and over the years they may have just gone out into the abyss.
Yeah. So quite a bit of this is a little bit of detective work. Just want to sort of go full circle with what Ron said. You were talking about Hello Pop, and when I came across it for the first time on Twitter, I hadn't actually made the connection that it was one of my uncle's films. Jack Cummings was my grandmother's older brother. And as you say, he started off making shorts at MGM, and then he moved on and eventually made dozens of iconic MGM films. But what really cracked me up and I found so incredibly ironic, Ron, was that this was actually found just a few miles away from where I live, and in a fellow's garden shed in a suburb of Sydney called Manly, and that you then reached out, I think, to perhaps, he reached out to you, and then you reached out to Paul Brennan, who is here in Sydney, and Paul at one point carried the nitrate canister on his lap on a bus in Sydney. Is that right, until it could get to you?
Yes, that's what happened.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
this collector, his home is floor to ceiling, some nitrate and many other films. And the way he got Hello Pop, very briefly, was in the early 60s, the movie exchanges were closing because television was coming in and so on. And they were emptying them out and bringing them to the garbage dump. So a bunch of collectors who were in their 20s at the time decided to pay off the garbage men and have them stop off at their houses, unload a lot of the films, and then they kept them. So only because of that was the print of Hello Pop that was destined to the landfill.
That's amazing, and I know that Paul and I are planning to go and see this gentleman, and he now has one of the Warner Archive DVDs that was released, and we will take that to him and bring this story entirely full circle. So I think on that note, we mightn't press the internet gods much farther. I want to thank you all for joining me. We had a wonderful first session. We were very much the early adopters and the guinea pigs for today's Film Preservation and Restoration Summit. I hope that everybody who was watching enjoyed hearing about what everyone is up to in this area. And I want to thank you, and we will hear more from you in the future, and all the best on your film preservation and restoration activity. Thanks again.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you very much, Alicia.
Thank you,
very much. All right. Thank you so much, and take care.